Ladies and gentlemen, every peace process is different because every peace process is governed by the concrete causes of conflict which is designed to resolve. We heard earlier that peace is about talking to your enemy. But why is your enemy your enemy? What's the problem about which you have a different point of view, which goes to the point that you're prepared to kill one another because of that difference? Is it possible to reformulate the problem in a way that you can both agree to the answer? To pose it in a way that is no longer a zero-sum game where one must gain and the other must lose. And that was one of the things that the Irish conflict peace process was about, was reformulating essentially what is self-determination for Ireland. Is self-determination for Ireland what a majority in the 32 counties say should be the arrangement, regardless of what a substantial minority in the northeast of the country were prepared to agree with? Or is it instead some formula for governing the northeast of Ireland on a basis that recognises that there are two allegiances within Northern Ireland, one Irish nationalist and the other loyalty to Britain, and that Northern Ireland will be governed henceforth on a basis which respects both, and that the goal of Irish self-determination would be achieved not by the majority in Ireland deciding as one unit what should be the future, but that there should be two referenda on the same day, one in Northern Ireland, one in the Republic of Ireland, on a new formula for working together in Northern Ireland. And if a majority is obtained in both of the parts of Ireland simultaneously, that would constitute self-determination for the entire people of Ireland that would be acceptable to all. And that essentially is what this document provided for. And when it was approved, it became an exercise in self-determination for the Irish people, which was approved by the Irish people, not in one referendum, but in two, in which a majority was obtained in both. Now, there are other issues that arose in the Irish peace process that are important. The first one I've referred to is, what is a nation? Is a nation based on allegiance, or is it based on territory? Is it possible to have people of the same nation, of different nations living together on the same territory? Or must they be separated physically into neat and differentiated territories? Also, obviously, if arms are taken up in pursuit of national self-determination, who is entitled to do that? If arms are to be taken up, should there not be a democratic mandate for the taking up of arms? Should individual groups with no democratic mandate from anybody have an entitlement to take up arms? Again, in favour of what they consider to be self-determination. And if a state permits that or doesn't suppress it, is that state giving up its legitimacy as a state? Because in many senses, if you're to have the rule of law, you first must have order. And it is states that create order. And one of the issues that we had, and I had in particular, in dealing with the disarmament of the IRA, which was a precondition for Sinn Féin being fully accepted into the peace process, was that the existence of an armed body that was not authorised by the Irish state, that was capable of threatening Britain or threatening the minority in Northern Ireland, the Unionist minority, and doing it supposedly in the name of the Irish people, was an affront to the legitimacy of my state, the Irish state. So we couldn't accept that. And equally, Unionists couldn't accept easily sitting down with Sinn Féin, as long as Sinn Féin was associated with the IRA, which still had arms and still had the capacity of killing people and using the threat of coercion to get their way in the negotiating table. So that was another set of difficult issues. What about armed groups? and how must they be subordinated to legitimate political power. Reference was made earlier here in this discussion to solving the land issue. There was a land issue in Ireland too. In the 17th century, a lot of the land, which was owned previously by Catholic supporters of King James II, who was illegitimately dethroned as the King of the United Kingdom by a coup d'etat, and William of Orange was installed in his place along with James's daughter Mary. But those who supported the legitimate monarch in Ireland and fought in his name at the Battle of the Boyne and the Battle of Aughrim, who were mainly Catholics, had their land taken from them. And the land was handed over to people who were supporters of King William. Now, that made for a very unequal society where those who had wealth were of one religious and political persuasion. They represented maybe 10 to 15% of the population, and the rest of the population had less wealth because the land had been taken from them or their co-religionists. That land problem in Ireland was solved before we looked for self-determination. The land problem was solved by Gladstone in the 1880s, where a tenant purchase scheme was arrived at, whereby the land was handed over really to the people who were working it, and the landlord system was abolished. So in many ways that was an important prior achievement that enabled the agenda to move forward to what form of national self-determination would Ireland have. Now, there were a number of steps along the road, and I'm hopefully going to move reasonably quickly to them without doing violence to truth. Legislative self-determination for Ireland was granted without a single shot being fired in 1914. Home Rule for Ireland was passed into law and signed by the King in September of 1914, without a single shot being fired. It was suspended for the duration of the war, which had started a month previously, because it was felt at the time not practical to be setting up a new administration in Ireland at the time that the United Kingdom, of which Ireland remained part, but with legislative independence within that framework, it would be a distraction from the war effort. However, in 1916, a group of people, the IRB and the IRA and the Citizens' Army, people who were extreme nationalists, who believed that getting independence as a gift from the United Kingdom wasn't true self-determination because it was coming as a gift from an external power and wasn't acceptable. They proclaimed on Easter Monday of 1916 that a republic existed as of right, not on the basis of a democratic mandate, because there would be no election to mandate it, but as of right because of the nature of the Irish people, that they were entitled intrinsically to self-determination. It was almost sort of blood and soil thing. Now that was stated in irreconcilable terms, that a republic existed as of right. It was a republic for 32 counties, even though in 4 at least of the 32 counties there was a majority of people who did not want to be ruled from Dublin. That problem was not dealt with at that time. However, in the wake of the conscription crisis, 1918, in the general election of 1918, a majority of the seats in Ireland were won by supporters of full Irish independence, who rejected Home Rule as insufficient and said we are going to declare a republic as of right. And they, instead of taking their seats in Westminster, established a parliament in Dublin known as Dáil Éireann, and they declared that a republic of 32 counties existed as of right, and that the British had to get out of Ireland and basically hand over the whole of Ireland to this new government that was established in Dáil Éireann. And of course, that led to war. War between British forces, supported by some Irish people, and the Irish Republicans who were demanding full independence. That war went on until mid-1920s. This was an atrocious war. But eventually, there was a wish for settlement. On the British side, they could see that they couldn't suppress this completely. And likewise, on the Irish side, on the Irish Republican side, there were a number of people, notably Michael Collins, Arthur Griffith, and others, who felt that half a loaf was better than no bread. That if they could get more than home rule, if they get a degree of independence that was more than home rule, without getting it for all 32 counties, but just for 26 counties, that might be acceptable. And essentially, that was what the Treaty of 1921 did. It created an Irish state which had essential sovereignty and was more than home rule, but it wasn't a republic in the sense declared in 1916 and affirmed again in 1918, and it didn't include the 6 counties of Northern Ireland, which subsequently got devolved governments of its own under the Government of Ireland Act of 1920 from Westminster. So as a result of that treaty being made, it was accepted by a majority in the Dáil, the newly established Parliament of the Irish people in the 26 counties. But a substantial minority refused to accept it. There was a civil war. The people who accepted the treaty won the civil war. But there was a substantial minority of people who felt that the original goal of a republic, not something made by treaty, but a republic as of right, and of all 32 counties, not 26, had been betrayed, and that continued on. Now, this was a problem that Eamon de Valera tried to solve by saying, rather than have our state established on the basis of a treaty with Britain, we'll have a new constitution of our own, and it'll be approved by a referendum in Ireland, and this he did in 1937. So you could argue that he repatriated the basis of the Irish state by basing it on a referendum of the people of his state rather than a treaty with Britain. And that was quite an achievement, I think, and reformulated the problem. But that was not accepted, and that accepted by the supporters of the IRA. Now, that constitution, which was adopted by a majority of the Irish people, said the only people who have any title to bear arms or to use arms to achieve the goals of the Irish people are the legitimate government of the state. So the continued existence of the IRA and its activities were not just a threat to Britain, they were also a threat to the legitimacy of our own state in Dublin, because they were in defiance of I think it's Article 15 of the Irish Constitution. Now, the partition of the island, remember there was 6 counties still under UK rule with a devolved administration, and an independent state, was deepened. Partition between the two parts was deepened by the fact that the Irish government, the Free State government, started to adopt tariff protection, which meant that there had to be border controls to ensure that goods imported from Britain paid the Irish tariffs. In the Second World War, the Irish state remained neutral, which again created a division because Belfast was at war, Dublin was not at war. Belfast was bombed, Dublin was not bombed, and that created a difference in perception about the situation. Meanwhile, a majority government in Northern Ireland was constituted based entirely on the support of those who favoured a union with Britain. The 60% at the time of the population who favoured union with Britain, they were always in power, and the 40% who favoured a united Ireland, or who at least had a different view on this, were always out of power. And this majority rule was discriminatory in the matter of employment, in the matter of housing, and in a variety of matters like this. And many of the nationalist minority in Northern Ireland who were the subjects of discrimination felt that they had been, rather that the south of Ireland had turned its back on them and said, you were happy to go ahead with your own independence with 26 counties and you're forgetting about us. And that alienation contributed to support for the IRA subsequently. Now, there were two IRA campaigns, one in the 1950s, which eventually was ended by the use of internment in the South, and one starting in 1968-69, which went on until 1998, the famous IRA campaign, which engendered, of course, retaliatory violence from the Loyalist side, and you had three sets of paramilitaries killing people within their own community to enforce discipline and killing people of the other community to advance their cause. So the peace process in Ireland was basically designed to find a way of giving those in the Republican movement in Ireland who felt at that time that Ireland had never had self-determination, that the 1918 election, where there was a slight majority in favour of, on the whole island, in favour of separation, that supposed act of self-determination had been betrayed by the treaty and by other developments, to give them a new expression of self-determination that would enable them to accept new arrangements. And those new arrangements were contained initially in outline in the Downing Street Declaration of 1993, agreed by my predecessor, Albert Reynolds, with John Major, developed further as a joint understanding between the Irish and British governments in the framework document agreed in 1995 by John Major and myself when I was Taoiseach, and finally brought to its full expression and acceptance by everybody, basically, or ostensibly by everybody, in the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, agreed between Tony Blair, Bertie Ahern, my successor, and the main unionist parties and nationalist parties in Northern Ireland. And that agreement was then put to a referendum in the Republic of Ireland and in Northern Ireland. And that was supposed to be a new act of national self-determination, which, on the basis of which the IRA ought to have been able to agree to put their arms away. Now, it didn't quite work out like that. The IRA probably oversold the agreement, or Sinn Féin probably oversold the agreement to their supporters, telling them the Brits are about to leave, this is just a preparation for the British leaving, and that wasn't the case. Now, in politics, sometimes people tell white lies in order to get a good outcome. Perhaps this was well motivated by some of the people that told those lies, or not. I won't get into that. But the reality was the British were not about to leave, and as we know, they haven't left. And then when that was becoming obvious, people who had the arms were unwilling to give them up. But eventually, after a lot of painful sort of toing and froing, walking in and walking out, unionists saying they wouldn't talk to Sinn Féin, even though Sinn Féin had got a lot of votes, because the IRA was associated with Sinn Féin, and IRA still had arms, they hadn't visibly disarmed. If the IRA just said that it's disarmed, that wouldn't be believed. So there had to be international verification of disarmament, which there was. But eventually, there was an acceptance that the IRA had put most of their arms beyond use. What that means, I'll leave to you to imagine, beyond use. It doesn't say they disappeared. But anyway, I don't want to go into that, and nobody knows for sure what happened. Better not knowing, perhaps. But on the basis of that, the institutions eventually got into operation. And they were devolved considerable powers into the Belfast administration. It is operating on a very complicated system. Now, obviously, what was unacceptable would be simple majority rule in Northern Ireland, because that would be permanent unionist rule, for the time being anyway. So they had to devise a system which would assure the minority that it wouldn't be simple majority rule. And what they came up with was a formula which said that any really important decision to be made within the new Assembly of Northern Ireland would have to command 60% of all the members in the Assembly supporting it, of whom they would have to represent 40% at minimum of the designated nationalist members and 40% of the self-designated unionist members. Now, sounds good. Difficulty with it was that it meant that each of the parties had to designate themselves, if they were to have a full vote, as on either side of a question to which there was no possible resolution peacefully. Because for unionists, the idea of a united Ireland is completely unacceptable, and for nationalists, agreeing to continued indefinite participation in the United Kingdom is unacceptable. And yet the parties were asked to define themselves in accordance with this fundamentally divisive and insoluble issue. And that has, I think, had the effect of sort of crystallizing the divisions. It has made the divisions, it has legitimated the divisions and made people identify with their divisions and the things upon which they disagree, rather than identify with the things upon which they agree. So that could be argued to be a structural flaw in the Good Friday Agreement. And that was one of the criticisms I made as leader of the opposition in 1998 when it came before the Dáil for approval. But I agreed with it because it was such a big step forward. But I did think that was a weakness. And also, ministers are not fully collectively responsible. Ministers are elected on a d'Hondt system, and I'm not going to explain that to you, but basically positions are allocated to parties in the government in accordance with their size. So every party, if it gets a minimum number of votes, has a minister in the government, regardless. Which that, of course, means that you don't really have a collectively responsible government. You have a government which is sort of an institutionalized conflict. And you don't have an opposition which is threatening the government, which might bring them down, which might make the government behave themselves and try and act in a more collective way. So part of the problem in Northern Ireland has come from the fact that the administration doesn't act collectively to the degree that it ought to, because of the safeguards that were put in place to protect minorities. And this shows that good ideas, and these were good ideas, can have unintended consequences. And the unintended consequences can, not be all that good. Now, also, there are other issues that are causing some division in Northern Ireland. And I think this is important to recognize in the case of other conflicts. Brexit, for example, is a conflict in a way in the making between the UK and the rest of Europe. That symbols are very important, and symbols are exceptionally important in Northern Ireland. Flags. What flag can you fly and where can you fly it? If you go into one area in Northern Ireland and you see the curbstones painted red, white and blue, you know that the people living in that area are all unionists. You go maybe 20 yards down the road and you go into another housing estate and the curbstones are all painted green, white and orange. You know that they're nationalists living in that area. What flag should fly on public buildings? Should people stand for the national anthem? Should the national anthem be played, given that the national anthem in Northern Ireland is God Save the Queen, and while many nationalists in Northern Ireland might like the Queen as a person, they're not so keen on the monarchy, or this particular line anyway, this particular house holding the monarchy, shall we say. We even have arguments about place names. Is Derry Londonderry or Derry? if people say it's Londonderry, you know that they're unionists. If people say it's Derry, good chance they're nationalists. Some unionists use it as well. There are, what do you commemorate? A huge number of people of the Irish nationalist tradition fought in the First World War in the trenches, and indeed many Irish nationalists from the south of Ireland fought in the Second World War in the British Army as well. But getting everybody to agree to commemorate Armistice Day and to get Sinn Féin to come to commemorations of the end of conflicts in which Britain was engaged, in which Irish soldiers were engaged in British uniforms, that was very important. And one of the things I was very pleased about when I was in office in 1995, when it was 50th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, and we had a commemoration in the beautiful War Memorial Park in Dublin in Island Bridge, which I recommend any of you that come to Dublin to go and see. I was really pleased that Sinn Féin sent some of their representatives to that. And that was a sign that things were moving in the right direction. And I think we need to think always about symbols and ways of making people feel that they're recognised, because the conflicts in Northern Ireland are not really about people of the nationalist community who have recently learned Irish wanting to go into the social welfare office to be able to talk in Irish to an official who may be of a unionist persuasion in Irish about what they're entitled to in terms of social welfare. I mean, that's ostensibly a big issue, but it isn't really a big issue. It's more about, is the Gaelic Irish tradition recognised and respected by the unionist community? It's about respect rather than practicality. And one should never underestimate those sorts of issues. Now, I think, what are the lessons that you can draw from the Irish process? And it has to be said, the Irish process has not reached its final destination, because the administration in Northern Ireland is not working now. Civil servants are making the decisions because initially Sinn Féin withdrew because they were unhappy that the First Minister, who was a unionist, who had been involved in something that was possibly a scandalous waste of public money, but that has yet to be determined, would continue on in office while it was being investigated. They said she should stand down for the time being. She said no, and they pulled out of the government. Now, I know lots of cases where Prime Ministers have stayed in office while some of their activities were being investigated. My successor, Bertie Ahern, stayed in office while a tribunal was investigating his affairs. I think Sinn Féin were unreasonable in bringing the administration down on that basis. But then they tried, and talks were put in place to try to resume the government. And Sinn Féin, as far as I can see, made very genuine offers to resolve the outstanding issues with the unionists. They were prepared to accept quite minimal advances on some of the issues that they'd been insisting on in regard to the Irish language, for example, quite minimal. But at that stage, the Ulster Unionists decided, or Democratic Unionists rather, had decided that they weren't having it, and they didn't attempt to sell. They made an agreement and then made no attempt to sell it to their own party. And the result is we have no administration in Northern Ireland today. Some of that is due to some of the design flaws that I referred to. But it's mainly due to the fact that people are luxuriating in their victimhood, luxuriating in their identity, and not thinking themselves into the minds and hearts of their previous or traditional antagonists, not trying to understand the issue from the perspective of their antagonist. The first rule of any negotiation, whether it's in business or in any other field, is ask yourself, what does your antagonist or your negotiating partner across the table, what do they really need? And if you try to identify with them and what they need, then you can start only then trying to find a formula whereby you get what you want, but in a fashion that allows them to keep what they need. That sort of thinking requires imagination. It requires a tremendous exercise of intellect. And that's, I think, really what's absent. It's not the design flaws to which I referred, which, the agreement could, notwithstanding those flaws, could have been made to work if the spirit was right. I think that's enough. I'm happy to take questions. I don't believe that the Irish peace process contains all the answers for peace building all over the world, but there may be individual sort of technical things we did to move over or move around or avoid particular roadblocks in our process that could be applicable in other processes elsewhere.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.